with you the whole day because there is Research Culture Week on, and I have to go to that. But I'll stay for the PhD researcher's presentation, which I'm very interested in.
Get rid of that.
Oh, okay. So you do
Running
your
off
stuff.
two computers.
Okay. Yeah. So what I'd like to do is talk big picture and relate that big picture to some of the work you're all doing. So I hope we can develop a kind of macro dynamic as we think about circular systems and particularly shifting towards circular systems. Sue has given me 25 minutes, so I'll try and stick to that. I'll put my stopwatch on. Okay, so it's a bit of a sad note to start off with, but I think it's important to remind ourselves that just over the last few years, there have been some major UN-backed reports talking about the state of the world, from the biodiversity angle, the climate change angle, food and nutrition, health, and all of them point to major challenges that have to be addressed in the next 10 years if we have a chance of mitigating, reducing some of the risks. Basically, all relevant biophysical indicators are turning negative, fast, very steeply and dangerously. And the emerging context is beyond human experience. And the costs of mitigation adaptation are rising very, very sharply for all societies. It's bad news, let's have that in the background, but I think it's very important context. Because industrial food, energy, and water systems are fundamentally unsustainable. That's been known some time, but it's been brought into sharp focus by some of these reports recently. Essentially, whether you're talking about a capitalist society, a socialist society, or a communist society, the production apparatus is organized on a linear model, a linear throughput model, in which it's assumed that there's an unlimited supply of natural resources on one side, and that the Earth has an unlimited capacity to absorb waste and pollution at the other end. We have a linear throughput model that's globalized, relying on long-distance value chains, and this has a huge carbon, ecological, and material footprint. So some have argued for some time that it's important to shift from this linear throughput model to a more circular metabolism in which you close nutrient loops, you recycle, you reuse, and shift to more renewable energy, sustainable goods and services, sustainable food and water systems. So we're talking about the creation of new ecologies that combine, that cluster together different elements we need to satisfy the means of life. And essentially, it's about mimicking nature so as to generate complementarities, synergies between different sub-elements of the system, but also ensure that the waste from one element is food or an input to the next element. And that's what you've all been working on, those principles. So there's been a lot of hype about the circular economy. Both people looking at alternatives to industrialization and the captains of industry have been looking increasingly to the possibilities of the circular economy. And it gives the impression that we're moving towards circular economy. But if we take a reality check and look at the amount of material import that was recycled in 2019 in the EU 27 economy, that's only 12%. It's very small. And the industrial economy is certainly not circular. It produces polluting waste, and it requires new supplies of energy and materials that are extracted from old and new commodity frontiers, and I'll come back to that. So the world's input of inorganic and organic materials is still going up. And even in countries where you have a non-growing industrial economy, that also requires continuous new inputs of energy and materials, because materials are recycled only to a small extent. And that's a feature of all industrialized societies, whether capitalist, socialist, or communist. So the impact on the environment and the social footprint of these systems is very high. So I mentioned extractive commodity frontiers. This linear system is dependent on accessing resources around the world from so-called commodity frontiers. And the resources can be crude oil, gold, metals, aluminium, bauxite, as well as rare earth minerals. This is from the Environmental Justice Atlas, and they've been documenting for some time. They're based in Barcelona, the University Autónoma de Barcelona. They've been documenting for some time sites around the world that are new commodity frontiers linked to the global economy. Now, these sites are places where there's enormous environmental destruction. You've seen pictures of mining, and how it smashes the environment. But it also has huge human costs. Human rights standards are not adhered to. There's a lot of child exploitation, etc. But there are also sites of resistance for environmental defender. And the Environmental Justice Atlas has been mapping places around the world where there has been destruction, but also responses from self-organizing communities to resist degradation of the environment and degradation of their livelihoods and life. So when we talk about circular models that link food, energy, and water, I think it's important to ask what kind of society does the model support? Are the developments in circular systems in conformity with the dominant model? So circular systems that are part of sustainable intensification, they link with robots, digital revolution, and global supply chains. There's a strong emphasis on science, very strong emphasis on science, and it essentially conforms to the productivist, growth-oriented model, right? It's business as usual, based on accumulation through dispossession, to quote David Harvey, one of the geographers you know. The other approach really stresses combinations of food, water, and energy sovereignty for other possible worlds. And here circular systems are understood as coming from practitioners, from science and social movements. There's a strong emphasis on the co-creation, the co-production and co-validation of knowledge by citizens, not just by scientists alone, but citizens being involved. And it's about transforming the dominant regime. Right? These two framings are quite important, and we can come back to them. So I'm interested in the transforming one. I'm not interested in conforming, right? And I just want to illustrate some of the things and some of the challenges a transformative agenda has. So it's about moving from uniformity to diversity. This is an agricultural example in which we rely in the center a lot on agroecology as the know-how needed to redesign food and agricultural systems in the image of nature, mimicking natural ecosystems. But it also draws on principles of eco-literacy, biomimicry, permaculture, all that school of regenerative practices, also organic and biodynamic farming. And these systems are circular at a larger scale, but also at a smaller scale. They're nested circular systems. So if you look at this, insects falling from the trees, litter falling from the trees into the pond, feed the fish, right? And the fish shit. And after a while, you've got lots of sludge down there, which can be scooped out and put on the fields. So you've got within, larger circular systems, you have nested circular systems that help the whole ecosystem function. Now, in agroecology, we use very often Gleason's typology to distinguish processes that conform to the productivist agenda, right? And more transformative approaches. So down here, essentially, you've got an agroecology that tries to increase the efficiency of industrial and conventional practices, or an agroecology that tries to substitute alternative practices for industrial and conventional practices, right? Moving up the scale, we've got more transformative approaches that basically seek to fundamentally redesign the whole agro-ecosystem, right, based on ecological processes. And further up, linking those highly diversified systems to networks of consumers, local markets, and local forms of economic exchange. Those distinctions are important. We often talk about integration of food, water, and energy. We can go one step further, integrating human settlement. I'm taking you here to Davis in California. It's a Mediterranean environment. And this Village Homes is the name of this place. It was designed in 1983, and it's still around. It's quite remarkable in that the water management, for example, relies on gravity, and water is captured in the landscape. It's gently smoothed out or given gradients. Water is captured in creeks and swales, as well as ponds, and that alone has helped replenish the underground aquifer. I mean, California uses a heck of a lot of water. It's a big problem. And at the time when this place was started off, there was scarcity. But after 5 years, the underground aquifers were replenished. But the water also meant that you could grow plants. So there's been a lot of edible landscaping in this environment, in which, you know, food plants, medicinal plants have been introduced, right? Vineyards, and the housing itself is made of passive solar heating, right? All the houses are arranged so that they capture as much solar energy as possible. Car traffic minimized, and lots of footpaths for children and visitors that are not sufficiently wide to accommodate cars, only bicycles. So this is careful design, right? The management governance is in the hand, well, it was initially in the hand of the collective of residents, now it's in the hands of the board of directors. They also introduced quotas to allow for the inclusion of low-income and Black community groups. It was 10% at the time. So this is an example which I visited this in 1987, and I was bowled over by this. You know, I thought this is the future. It's going to spread very fast. It's so sensible. You know, it lowers ecological footprints. You know, we had Rio plus 10. There was, you know, all there. And this very elegant integration of food, energy, water, housing, and circular systems with a downscaling of carbon, ecological, and material footprints. So that visit was quite formative for me because it's about my own vision of transformation, which is about supporting approaches that restructure and re-territorialize food and energy production as well as water management within decentralized circular systems that mimic natural systems at different scales, you know, from individual farm plots, neighborhoods, municipalities to whole cities. And that vision is not new. It echoes the proposal of a Russian anarchist geographer, Peter Kropotkin, who was an incredible geographer. And he developed a vision of an agrarian industrial mutualism in which most economic activities are relocalized in villages, municipalities, mixing both agricultural and industrial elements, and where production is controlled by those who are engaged in it. He was an anarchist, you know, he was looking for systems that people could control for themselves rather than have the state or the market doing things for them. Now, interestingly, at this point in time, and your work shows this, that the building blocks for moving towards this agrarian industrial mutualism do exist. You know, enhancing functional biodiversity, which we do a lot in agroecology. The idea of ecological clustering of industries to create synergies, complementarities. Also the principles of design based on the 8 R's, re-evaluating, reconceptualizing, restructuring, redistributing, relocalizing, reducing, reducing, and recycling. Okay, these principles exist. and they can be applied to both rural and urban landscapes. But the question is, how do you make this transformation for circular systems? How do you make it happen on a large scale? And this is where we have to talk about, policies, institutions, things that get in the way and things that can enable. Well, the first thing would be to adopt a national policy for degrowth in production and consumption, right? To have that radical shift from globalized linear systems to relocalized circular models that link food and energy and water production as well as waste management. Doing that as part of a process, a controlled process of degrowth in production and consumption that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, and poverty within and between territories. Now, when I say degrowth in production and consumption, it doesn't mean imposing scarcity on people. It's about doing things differently. Here is the infrastructure needed to produce an industrial egg, right? And all that together, we do an energy analysis, is between 10 and 15 units of fossil fuel energy for 1 calorie of food in the form of an egg. Okay? There are more elegant designs based on agroforestry, agroecology, which still use modern technology, right? But a lot of these processes are carried out by plants, animals assembled to provide refuge, shelter, and food for the chicken. And the energy ratio of eggs produced this way is nearly the reverse, for 2 units of energy expended. No, sorry. No, let me get this right. Yeah, it's 10 times less than the industrial model. Another example is tomato ketchup. You love tomato ketchup. So we say reduce production and consumption of tomato ketchup. Now it's important to know, I think, that the average bottle of tomato ketchup in the supermarket requires something like 150 steps, transport and processing steps for its manufacture. This sort of model, right? This is work done in Sweden. Now that can be replaced with a much more localized cottage industry type of thing, right, in which you don't use plastic bottles, you use glass that's washed and sterilized, you use agroecologically produced tomatoes, you use greenhouses that are heated by biogas rather than fossil fuel. It's perfectly possible. And you shift the system. Now, interesting, there was a group of Cambridge-based scientists, career engineers. They looked at many of the products we rely on for our lives, and they reckon that achievable design changes could reduce global energy consumption by 73%. So this is what I mean by, a degrowth in production and consumption. Be much more savvy. I'm not saying people shouldn't eat eggs, shouldn't eat tomato ketchup. We can do this differently in more elegant ways that are kinder to the planet and ourselves. Now, thinking about what needs to happen to shift towards circular systems, it was interesting that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, at the time of COP26 that finished in October, he warned that promises to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are pointless while governments around the world persist with investments in fossil fuels. And I quote, "Promises ring hollow when the fossil fuels industry still receives trillions in subsidies." Now, similarly, I would argue here that promises to reduce biodiversity loss, greenhouse gas emissions through circular systems are pretty pointless in Europe and elsewhere if these countries persist with investments in petrochemical-based systems. So financing transformative circular system is key for climate change adaptation, mitigation, and much, much more. Talking about financial flows globally. There's also a need for increased public funding for relevant research for the development of circular systems. We've been troubled to see that in agroecology, very, very small amounts of public research money goes to agroecological work. In the USA and UK, projects that emphasize agroecology based on agroecosystem diversification, they only represent 0.6 to 0.5% of the entire agricultural research budget. 0% of the European Union funds channeled through the FAO, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, the World Food Programme, between 2016 and 2018, 0% supported transformative agroecology. And while only 2.7% focused on substituting harmful impacts and practices with less degrading ones. And if you look at overseas aid, you might expect that overseas aid would support agroecology and low-cost solutions, but no. You look at the UK, France, Germany, overseas aid, less than 3 to 5% of agriculture aid budgets fund agroecological R&D. So this means that these kinds of elegant systems can't develop. Some of the elegant systems that you're working on can't develop. I'll just explain this. So in apple and pear orchards in Northern Europe in particular, Shropshire sheep, right, are fantastic because not only do they eat the weeds, they also eat dead leaves that contain fungal diseases. So the presence of the sheep in this landscape ensures pest control for weeds and also diseases. In addition to that, organic matter is cycled. I mean, the sheep eat and they shit. You know, it's happening, right? So you're fixing carbon. And it ensures that there are many benefits, you know, landscape beauty, I would say, but also healthy apples and pears, as well as meat, wool, etc. So these are some of the principles of paper, but these systems are not at all or hardly researched. We're one of the few centers in the world that's doing this. Right? And similarly, your own work, which we'll be hearing about, breathes a massive boost in public funding for R&D. But it's not public funding, increasing public funding to do the same kind of research. It's about transforming ways of learning, transforming knowledge. So it's about democratizing science and technology research with increased funding of public research for transdisciplinarity approaches that include people in the co-creation of knowledge. Now that has massive implications for organizational cultures, operational procedures, reward structures of places like Coventry University and other universities, right? But in parallel with that, there's a need to recognize there's a lot of innovation, a lot of self-managed research that's taking place outside of universities. It's in the hands of people, farmers, water users. So the need to use money to strengthen these forms of autonomous learning and action that emphasize the strengthening of horizontal links and networks for grassroots innovation and decentralized self-managed research, as well as citizen oversight over the production of knowledge. So quite revolutionary, but those are the sorts of change that we need to see happen to the knowledge industry if we want to be able to address some of the big challenges. It has to produce different knowledge and it has to produce it in a different way with different people. Now, an obvious one, but it needs to be stated, all these systems to exist require, you know, access to natural resources, to land, to water, to seeds, to credit. And it needs to be emphasized that in the face of widespread acquisition and privatization of land and water, we need to ensure more equitable, more just access, use and control over natural resources. That's key for the spread of circular system, that security of tenure. So it means, you know, abandoning investment policies that favor land acquisitions and instead focus much more on strengthening collective, customary forms of tenure, as well as removing discrimination against women and people of color, Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups. Everywhere in the world, women have far less access and tenure rights than men. There's a huge gender injustice which prevails all over the world. So that has to change. We also need very different markets that can help transform, make the shift towards circular systems. And it's interesting that these circular systems, at least in their transformative version, they build alternative networks through forms of economic exchange that really reinforce relations of proximity and connections between producers and consumers. They relocalize and re-embed production and consumption of food, energy, and water within territories. And there are a number of, institutional innovations that can be very helpful in creating markets and stimulating that process. Public procurement systems, the public procurement of locally produced and processed organic foods, agroecological produce, very, very important. They promote dietary diversity, better nutrition security, and they've been used to feed people in schools, hospitals, and public canteens in countries as diverse as Italy, Austria, Denmark, and Brazil. Now, that public procurement mechanism can be applied to source local energy or local water. And this is a very strong lever that can reward people who are developing the circular system and trying to get a living from them. Now, this one I think is important to looking at the financial architecture that's being built right now worldwide. There's a need to call for disinvestment in major greenhouse gas emitters and drivers of biodiversity loss. I'll just take one example. The production and use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, which is perhaps the most energy intensive element, input to farming. That accounts for roughly 21.5% of annual direct emissions from agriculture in 2018, according to recent research. The problem is, nitrogen fertilizer use is expected to increase by 50% by 2050. There are alternatives to nitrogen fertilizer, agroecological organic farming alternatives based on green manures, composting, the use of nitrogen fixing legumes, etc. But the spread of agroecological alternatives to synthetic nitrogen use partly depends on financial institutions disinvesting in agribusiness corporations. And this is staggering. I only came across this information recently. UK financial institutions, mainly clustered around London and in London, their estimated carbon emissions, that's carbon emissions associated with financial investments in all sectors, in water, energy, food, manufacture, etc., amounts to 805 million tons. More interestingly is that if you compare that figure with the emissions of other countries, you realize that if financial institutions were a country, they would have the 9th largest emissions in the world. In other words, larger than Germany. That's the power of finance. And it needs to be redirected for the public good. Now I'm going to get even more wacky if you think Michelle's completely over the top. Thinking about the conditions that are needed for the spread of circular systems as part of a transformation agenda. It's pretty critical that there are changes that give much more material security to citizens. It's also important that men and women have free time for democratic deliberations, the co-creation of circular systems, and for practicing the art of participatory democracy. And that art of participatory democracy becomes very important when you think about the governance regimes that are appropriate for localized circular economy systems. We're talking about local adaptive management, and we're talking about locally driven governance based on local knowledge, local indicators, etc. Now, for that to happen, people have to have free time to be able to engage in participatory democracy for that local adaptive management and governance of circular systems. It's not a small point. It's very difficult to see how a diversity of circular systems could be managed centrally by a bureaucratic state or by corporations. They're into standardized blueprint solutions that often miss the mark. As soon as you have systems that are tailored to local ecosystems and culture, you need to decentralize, evolve, management decisions and governance, and put it in the hands of people who are resident in those territories and use those systems as a means of livelihood. So how could that happen? Again, questions about redirecting finance and policies, introducing a guaranteed and unconditional minimum income for all. The Swiss had a referendum on this a few years ago. It didn't get through, but they had a 2-year debate and said, could we have, an unconditional minimum income, which would give something like 2,500 euros to each person, regardless of gender, age, and without means testing. Very interesting concept. Equally, to create time and material security, it's about reducing time spent in wage work and ensuring there's a much fairer sharing of jobs between men and women, right? And finally, all this taking place as part of a process of relocalizing plural economies that combine both market, money-based exchanges with non-monetary forms of economic exchange based on barter, reciprocity, gift relations, and solidarity within and between territories. And we need to talk about redistribution. We're currently witnessing a growing gap between the rich and the poor. Currently, the hyper-rich, that's less than 100 people, own and control more wealth than 50% of the world's population. And that process is increasing. The oligarch scandal has exposed the extent to which some individuals have amassed wealth and continue to amass wealth. This is happening well beyond Russia, in France, in Germany, etc. And the wealthiest 1% of the world's population emit more than twice as much carbon dioxide as the poorer half of the world. So, putting this on the political agenda, how do you reverse these processes of accumulation through dispossession, nationally and globally? And that means talking about the redistribution of wealth, including through taxes on the hyper-rich, taxes on financial speculation, and closing down tax havens and fiscal paradises. And it's about transferring the surplus wealth from the hyper-rich to fund the regeneration of diverse circular systems and local economies. Now, a few of us in CORE were looking at agroecology and what needed to happen to scale out agroecology, how to ensure a massive transformation at the societal level towards agroecological practices. I've adapted this, as is work a few of us did, I've adapted to circular systems and what needs to happen for equity, sustainability, and resilience. The first point is that transformation needs to focus much, much more on the wider social, political, and economic context. We can't have sectorial approach. We need to have a very holistic approach. It has to be systemic rather than sectoral, and looking at simultaneous and mutually reinforcing actions for change. So we identified 6 domains of transformation, which I've mentioned here, access to land, to water, to seeds, so access to natural ecosystems, but also knowledge and culture, including research and development, markets, systems of exchange and finance, networks, which I didn't mention very much, but it's to do with local organizations and the federations they form, questions around equity and gender and discourses. Now, we viewed these as individual domains of transformation and recognize that where the domain would go depend on the balance between disabling factors that would lock in the system and enabling factors that would encourage a shift. So these dynamics and structures constrain the shift to diverse circular systems, or on the contrary, they enable them. I suggest that this little model, this thought organizing tool, could be quite useful when you think about your own work, because it can be applied at a micro scale for a particular system to think about that system, but also how could it be scaled up at the territorial level, at the national level, and beyond. So If you haven't understood my own biases and my own positionality, I'll spell it out even more. I'm very much interested in finding, transformative processes that recreate the democratic political realm and regenerate a diversity of autonomous local circular food and energy water systems within territories. And they have to support social justice and ecological sustainability. And that emphasizes strong power reversal processes based on the self-organizing capacities of people, ordinary citizens, and their collective power to reclaim spaces currently controlled by disabling governments and corporations. So I rest my case. Thank you. Sorry, I overshot by 5 minutes. Yeah.
So has anybody got any questions or comments? Timo's got his hand up. Oh,
Yeah.
Do we, Timo? Can you show him?
Can we
Yeah,
show Timo?
yeah.
Right.
You go on.
All right, I'm not taking savvy. Thanks.
Hi, Timo. You wanted to ask a question?
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That's great. Yeah, thanks a lot. I think that was a fantastic big picture. That's a great start into that day, and I really appreciated a lot of these transformative ideas and yeah, the big picture framing. I just have a question or a comment. Maybe a very personal question to you, Michael. How hopeful are you in terms of what you're sketching? Because the thing is, there's this massive. I mean, one comment would be there's this massive, and I'm sure you're aware of this massive knowledge action gap that we know. So we know already a lot, and we see all the stranded assets and all the political interests that really keep us away from making these major shifts. And the second point is, I'm really afraid that I'm quite interested in your model that you showed in terms of the locked-in regime and the niches and these 6 domains of intervention, you could say, or transformative action. That really resonates with a lot of work that we do here at Drift in Rotterdam, from the perspective of sustainability transitions or transformative change, as we frame it. I was missing a bit the even broader context, like long-term trends or even shock events or disruptive events that unfortunately always intervene when we think now the niches start to stabilize and get more and more potential to break through or really open up windows of opportunity to unlock parts of the current food systems or agricultural regime. Because I mean, tragically, that's also what we currently see geopolitically with the war in Ukraine, right? Because fertilizer production was really high in Russia and in Ukraine, wheat production was really high, and now you see a crisis in Ethiopia happening, and in other world contexts due to that development. And just the last comment, what I'm really concerned about is that, and I simply don't have an answer there, is that if we are politically on a promising way, and I saw some really good signs in the Commission in Brussels in terms of changes in the Common Agricultural Policy, incentives and new funding streams, as you have indicated, into circular alternatives. But now what we see food system-wise is that with the war in Ukraine, we have a major setback now, and we basically say, oh, no, food security is obviously highest priority, and now we go back to industrialized, intensive food production in France, in Germany, and we basically, the farm to fork strategy at the Commission is basically put completely on hold. And I don't have an answer, but I would be interested in your comments, and that maybe brings me back to my initial question. What gives you hope in telling that whole story, or what would be your model of actual transformation happening? Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. And I think they're very important questions. What gives me hope? Well, by nature, I'm an optimist, but I'm also a realist. And I get hope from many actions that are taking place right now across the globe, among networks of citizens, social movements, among younger people, the emergence of the consciousness of younger people, you know, clustering around Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter. There's a very interesting dynamic there, and it's the new generation. I also get hope from the fact that the system is breaking down in a very visible way. We saw during the pandemic that long distance supply chains were deeply problematic. We're seeing now with the war in Ukraine that reliance on food produced a long, long way away makes a country like UK or your own country extremely vulnerable. Now, this geographical division of labor, this specialization in production, and this outsourcing of production has only happened recently in human history. We can turn it around. Where I am, I completely agree also with you that there are surprises, there are jokers in the pack, there are things that happen in a very unpredictable way. We've now moved into a world of massive uncertainty, ecological, social, political, in a very big way, and that's what I referred to in the first slide. You know, and it's important to bear that in mind. The information climate scientists only had 6 months ago is now outdated in the light of new findings from what's happening in the Amazon, the Arctic, and the Antarctic. Changes happen very, very quickly. Now, I think there's a perception that's growing among ordinary people that things are wrong, and that they're being hurt by mainstream policies. So we may find acts of rebellion, pushback, I don't know. These are interesting. But the flip side of that, of course, is that historically, big companies and capitalism have been very good at exploiting crisis. It was Naomi Klein who said, that a crisis is always good for capitalism. And currently there are a number of crises, and they are phenomenal market opportunities for large corporations who want to maintain their political and economic power in society. And there's some massive battles happening around food, water. So you keep hope by engaging in these debates. You know, we're in a university environment, we're interacting with students, we're shaping young minds, and I think we should have always the audacity to ask questions that are tinted with hope and not accept the status quo as something, given forever. Because history shows that things change, even when we think it's not possible. So that's what sustains my hope. But I also admit that some days I am very, very low when I read news about climate change, what's happening in the Amazon, or the disappearance of environmental defenders. We're dealing with topics that affect you. I think it's important to get emotional and intellectual support from groups like this and others to be able to sustain this. Anyway, that was a long-winded answer.
Thanks a lot. Many thanks.
Good question. Yeah. Hi. Yeah.
No.
I was going to ask, do you feel that we have a clear enough narrative yet developed for how the type of localized social economies
Can you hear that, Timo?
supply and support cities and urban environments, given that we still have this concentration of people in cities? And it is difficult for me to see how we can portray a world where the kind of systems we're talking about, we all want, and the kind of Schumacher perspective, very much that is the localized production we see it going, that can actually provide for cities around the world. And the other thing that always worries me, apart from this scaling out issue we always have, is the sheer momentum of the existing systems we have. They don't move quickly.
No.
And are we going to have enough time to actually shift? How can we make that shift happen faster?
I don't think there is a clear narrative that's widely owned by many people in walks of life. There are narratives that are interesting, including going back in time. You know, the narrative which Peter Kropotkin came up with in Fields, Faculty Workshop is very relevant when we think about, you know, integrating municipal agriculture. It's still very relevant, has a modernity to it. There are new movements coming up in the city, like the new municipalist movement, which is very, very important, you know, building on principles of libertarian municipalism, of no adoption. That's another narrative, but they're minority narratives. I take that. I think what's missing is that whilst there are these crises, you have experts, expert politicians, expert and consultants who think about solutions, and all citizens are not involved in discussions and deliberations to shape those. And yet there have been some fantastic examples recently in Ireland of citizen assemblies about abortion laws, citizen assemblies in West Africa, and you know there are models of. Sorry about this. There are models of deliberative spaces that could involve many more people in discussions about the future. Because these are issues that affect, you know, the fundamental needs of people, their society, and that's not happening. And I think until we have a large-scale process of, you know, inclusive deliberation, many spaces, many new publics where the issues are discussed and you can look at each pros and cons, we're not going to get narratives developed.
Yeah.
And I think that is not being allowed because expert politicians, technocrats, business confiscate decision making. So this is a problem, but it doesn't mean it's not possible.
No, so we do need to work harder.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's why universities are very important. Provided you don't box yourself in and accept the dominant paradigm, you need to step out. Reimagine. That's the luxury we have. And we need to exercise that power of imagination. Because there's another generation of professionals coming in and carry out ideas. Okay.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
No, just a quick one. You said this agrarian industrial mutualism. That kind of assumes that it is possible to have a mutualism in a way with industry. And I just wanted to quiz you on that. You know, we did one proposal, a legal proposal for the university. We called it deindustrialization, and it wasn't funded. But is the assumption that mutualism is possible maybe not right? You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
So
so
that's
is the word industry. It's not the kind of industry we're talking about now, which is dirty, polluted, resource intensive. Again, one can build many of the things that we rely on at the level of private industries or mutualized funds that are part of circular systems. And so the industrial base would be different to what it currently is. You know, the industrial paradigm has to be different. Otherwise, I don't see mutualism possible. It's like asking organic farming to coexist with GM agriculture. But when Peter Kropotkin thought about this, he was thinking about industry organizing forms of workshops and ateliers, small scale, So what would it mean for a retailized food system, water system? Not only would you want more farmers there, but you would want more flour mills. You would have more people working in micro dairies, small abattoirs, and so on. And you could have technology, right, that is much more low impact, that still borrows from advances in science and technological innovation, but it would be much more miniaturized. I started doing video at the time when you'd have to go into a room this size to edit your film. And then 15 years later, I was editing video in villages in India because the technology has utilized and also had a much lower energy consumption. So that, you know, there are things possible there. I think we need to ditch the idea that it's this kind of industry we have today that could be combined in mutually beneficial ways with and vice versa.
Maybe stronger define what kind of industry or field, you know, we want, you know, where kind of.
Yeah, exactly. Again, and
This is for the next project.
that's the importance of this debate, citizen debate, shaping
Yeah.
social choices.
Yeah.
We really enjoyed your presentation because it kind of nicely summarized a lot of the things our students have been working on and also with the projects that was focused on. And I also really appreciated when you talked about the importance of resources and time for actually enabling these changes on the local scale. I mean, we mirrors also what Gloria had found in her PhD on community-based natural resource management, that actually if you want participation, people need the space and the resources to do so. It doesn't just happen in our current system, where even academics don't feel like they have the time to engage and think and have. I mean, I really appreciate having this time where we can talk, but we've not really done this a lot, even throughout the project, where we just sort of discussed and reflected. And I think that's one of the points I was kind of wondering if that's potentially missing when you have the 6 domains you mentioned. You didn't really talk about education. And for me, that starts in school, where it's so much about outcomes. It's not about abilities to engage, to critically look at the world. And there might be private sector schools which normal people can't afford, where they have a bit more space to do that. But normally it's really fitting the system, supporting where we are at. That's the outcome. And that is from, not from kindergarten, because I think there they actually still play, but school, it starts and it goes to universities, where we're really just looking at how do we fit into the status quo, how do we fit into the system we have. So I kind of wonder, shouldn't we also, as academics in universities, create many more spaces? I mean, the Research Culture Week now is great, but I think things like that, we need more critical debate. How do we fund research? Who's deciding on it? Who's setting the agenda? I mean, when you talked about the low percentages going into agroecology, it's just really depressing. But it's, I also feel like, given, for example, Coventry University, we don't really argue at all about the way the university is run, because it's so controlled, and we don't have space and time to actually question how we do research, how we teach our children is actually influencing all these aspects. And I don't really have a question as such. I just think that maybe education is a domain in a very broad sense, which isn't really captured currently in what you had sort of.
We did capture it under knowledge and culture. But I take your point fully. It could be expanded a lot more. If you look at the book, it could be expanded a lot more. And I think it is a very important point of intervention, people have changed. We work in primary schools, secondary schools. Thinking about the design of schools, they could be done on circular models, with energy, water. They could, and those living labs are fantastic learning grounds for children. Similarly, schools can be governed by children. I came across a wonderful model in France of a self-managed school where the kids were taking the decisions. They would meet regularly like board members rooms and they discussed the various issues. And these were toddlers of 8 years old, 10 years old, and they were talking about budgets. So this is a school into citizenship, which is very, very important, which most of our education systems just cut out. We're not taught, we're not socialized into being citizens, and we need to do that if we're talking about change. But to do that in a context where the technological base, the design, already reflecting circular system ideas would be amazing. And you know, it's something we need to push for. And there may be examples, you may know this from the Schumacher College and other examples. But modern Coventry University, I would say, you know, the government system is most unimaginative, most wedded to orthodoxy, and ensuring that their mates get contracts and so on. There's a real lot in that. But again, because there's a lot, doesn't mean that we should raise it and talk about the possibilities. I think, you know, the technical, physical, institutional design and reinvention of schools at primary, secondary level, and universities, because it would flow. If kids learn to self-manage and allocate money in primary, secondary school, you'll be sure that they'll ask for it in university. We have the skills to do it.
Yeah.
I'm completely with you on that.
We have a question from Kevin.
Thank you.
Very interesting discussion. Wondering if the circular economy narrative is still too immature to understand the implications of reduced consumption, the effect this has on rising debt, lowering of tax base, and most of all, implications for increasing inequality in societies. Do we have a clear idea of the implications for CE and how should be transformed for what purpose?
Could you read the beginning again? My mind wandered.
Yeah, Kevin, would you like to? Maybe you can ask it better. Are you there? Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to the discussion, which is really interesting, and someone raised the point earlier on about the narrative and how developed or mature that narrative in the circular economy is. And we're struggling to find examples, I suppose, of it and to be convinced of it. And I've just, in fact, come back from another conference and had a conversation with someone who's talking through the corset economy. And the corset economy is almost, takes the idea of strapping in, of binding in, and the increasing issue of reducing, becoming more efficient, and who benefits from that efficiencies. And as you do so, perhaps there is increasing rising debt as we reduce our consumption, which is a good thing. Rising debt may not be, and then a reduction in our tax base. And for us, and I'm coming from the South African context, the increasing implications for increasing inequalities. And so it's really just an idea, I suppose, in the discussion here about the clear implications for how our more abstract and theoretical understanding of CE can be transformed into something that deals particularly with the inequalities within our economy, within our societies. And how does the transformation really link towards that important component? And I really enjoyed the emphasis on inequalities because those are the real headline news, I think, for many countries around the world. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but where is CE going in terms of its transformation?
It does make a lot of sense, Kevin, and thank you for that. I put in a slide earlier on, so we need to think critically about our own positionality. Say what kind of circular economy or circular systems we want to support. Much of the current conversation around circular systems is developing in such a way that they fit into the productivist growth orientation. Minimizing maybe waste and ensuring better resource efficiency, but it's locked into a growth-oriented model. It's not about societal change. It's not about changes in politics, economics. It's very technical. and it's receiving a lot of support from industry. You know, Davos, the World Economic Forum, hosted a very interesting discussion on circular economy a few years ago, and there are lots of industry people who are behind it, but they see the efficiency element, right? And they see how it could be, it could make capitalism more efficient and greener, but it's not a fundamental change in a transformative sense of ownership over the means of production, redistribution of wealth, etc. And that's why I presented my thoughts under the rubric of the transformative circle, knowing very well that this is a minority view, and we have other tensions in other domains of sustainability, where some people think much more in terms of increasing efficiency, minimizing certain levels of pollution, but are not embedding these innovations in a wider context of change that can address questions of structural inequality, freedom, self-determination, and re-inhabiting ecosystems and territories. Thinking hard about the problems of separating productive and reproductive labor, etc. I want to open the box, and I told Sue I would do that. But thank you for that question, Kevin. And yes, we could have circular systems developed, very, very efficient, very clean, but they could be profoundly inequitable. They could be circular systems for the rich, and we still have these processes of accumulation through dispossession of the majority.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. I think I'm with you. How do we open up this box? And I think it's so refreshing to see or hear your talk this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah.
Margaret, did you have a question? If it's a quick one.
Yeah.
I'm a chatty person. I'm out of that.
You mentioned a fair number of ideas and properties that this change that you would like to achieve must have. And obviously you're advocating a very radical change compared to what we have now. And I'm wondering how do you see that change happening? Is that a gradual process? Is that a slow process? Or does it have to be a very sudden disruption? Because I'm kind of, from these locked-in institutions that you mentioned, I'm kind of thinking that they have a very high resilience built into them because of the power that they have. And that means that they will be able to adapt to any gradual changes and therefore stay locked in and maybe tweak whatever the circular economies, as you say, turn them into their benefit. So how do you disrupt that lock-in in an actual practical way rather than identifying a couple of properties that the idealized world would have? How do you break that existing resilience in these institutions or powers that are locked in? And how do you ensure that once you've broken it, that your system you have in place will be resilient enough to withstand any onslaught from anybody else who wants to change it?
Yeah. Well, that's a tough question. I mean, incremental or rapid change is very difficult to say. So it's likely to be context specific, and it's also likely to depend on the balance of social force between current power holders and people who contest the union. I don't know. Historically, in some places, change has taken place very quickly, and other places it's taken slower. What I think is interesting is that among the groups and networks that are talking about the need for these kinds of shifts, agroecology, circular systems, and transformation, is that their emphasis is very much on popular education, linking up, working at a municipal level. And I've been very impressed with the the new municipal movement, which is very strong in Spain, but also in Latin America, where you have a lot of popular education, a lot of interesting initiatives following policy dialogues with local mayors, and changes taking place. So that's hopeful. A fair bit of what I included this morning is actually borrowed also from the food sovereignty movement. Those of you who are familiar with food sovereignty will recognize some of the ideas of the food sovereignty movement. Now that represents several hundred million farmers, indigenous people around the world, and it's been building with strength, engaging with policymakers at the national level and the UN, with bits and starts, because we're dealing with messy political processes. Where will that go? I mean, I can't say. I can't say because except that it's going to be context specific and depend very much on that groups of social forces and the level of awareness of different actors. There may be some events that precipitate realizations. I mean, I think with the Ukraine war, a lot of people are realizing things which were completely off their radar screen during the pandemic also. You know, it was quite a shock. That global supply chains were interrupted. So there are surprises, but the system as a whole is extremely resilient, and it's geared up to ensure that it stays resilient and in a hegemonic position. Now it has the army, it has the police, etc. So it's not a straightforward one to answer. I recognize the difficulties, but any process of change like that is likely to be complicated, messy. I just can't say. The big unknowns for me are the bigger planetary questions. The way, you know, we're in the sixth massive extinction of biodiversity. We're now reaching very, very worrying tipping points for climate change. A lot of things will collapse. What would happen then? You know? What would be the response? I don't know. And I don't have a crystal ball. But what's important is these conversations to say amongst ourselves and why we say, well, what can we anticipate, what could we do, etc. Because this is going to require a response by many people, not just a few who are in the know. So it goes back to education, it goes back to citizen deliberation, it's all that. And I'm not saying that's happening sufficiently now. It does need to happen much, much more. Yeah, those are difficult questions.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think we need to say thank you to Michelle for the
Thank you. Pleasure.
So we now come on to the PhD student talks.
Yeah,
Have
Timo's
you got an order for this?
Timo's going to discuss Rachel's first. Timo, can you share, or do you not? Do I need to give you? I'll do it from my test.
Yeah, it looks good. Just a second.
If you do.
And I'll send you a PDF.
Okay, I'll do that now.
Yeah, because there's a couple of photos I haven't had permission.
The administration is of the more functional technicals, and then we've got the forest led and
Yeah.
the natural and the agriculture.
Yeah.
Where have those come from?
They're from the permaculture manual. And we've got a couple of copies. This is large A4. We've got a couple of copies of that manual, the permaculture
Okay,
manual.
I might have a look at that because that's
Yeah.
quite a drag on it.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
They're lovely pictures as well.
Thank
Explain it really well.
Yes, pictures are
Yeah, they're
half the
perfect.
job.
Okay, Timo, it looks like everyone's just rushing for coffee at the moment.
Yeah, okay, good. So I do, what do we do? A 5-minute break?
It's not an official break, but yes.
Okay, that's fine. I'm ready. That's fine.
Okay, great.
Just let me know.
Hi.
The making of Okay, yeah, I get what you mean. Sorry.
I think you could say that's low. I think it's low.
Shall we try and start now? Yes. Maybe just talk about I've done this one. Everyone sit down now, we can start. Can we start?
Yes. No, they don't. I think they just said that we talk about straight away. Why that's not.
Okay. Over to you, Timo.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It sounded like a well-needed and well-deserved and very vital coffee break on your end. That's great, and you deserve it. I'm alone in my office over here. That's it's a bit silent, but anyway, yeah, I'm great to still be able to participate online. Give you a quick reason behind that. We currently have a couple of people on sick leave, not only due to COVID, and that's the reason why I had to step in also and work on additional projects at the moment. So I started avoiding additional traveling efforts, but it's great to still be with you online. Unfortunately, Rachel Greer, our PhD student, I mean, most of you know her very well. She's also currently on sick leave. So for the summary of her work and her PhD work, I'm currently stepping in here. So bear with me if I'm maybe not most updated on in every detail, even though I was and still are her supervisor, but she obviously started stepping on the shoulders of her supervisors as it's supposed to be. But I'm starting this short summary of Rachel's PhD work with, so to say, the great news that the whole thesis book, as we call it in the Netherlands, is actually submitted. So Rachel has, I would say, 98% of her PhD are done. The whole thesis is submitted. The small committee, how we call it over here, has agreed that the thesis can go on to the larger committee and that she passes on to the defense. And I will get to this at the end. And on the left-hand side, you see how Rachel has framed her work. So it's entitled "Governing the Transition to a Circular Economy: Key Dynamics, Paradoxes, and Implications for Strategizing." And below is the similar title in Dutch, if you're interested to read that as well. But I think with this short presentation, it really links nicely to what we heard in the previous keynote by Michael, because it's indeed here about the question of how longer-term change processes towards a circular economy might actually further evolve or might happen, and which paradoxes or which obstacles and barriers this transition may also face. And on the left-hand side, you roughly see a bit her procedure, because she started with an in-depth literature review on the one hand, on, so to say, our institute's theoretical backbone, that's the sustainability transitions literature. And her second body of theories was then the circular economy literature. And then she conceptualized her framework and her work and started with an empirical study that I will briefly introduce in a second. And then out of this empirical data, she came across this observation of one of the key paradoxes or trade-offs in these transition ambitions, you could say. And that led to the next step, chapter 5 in her thesis, where she was thinking about a heuristic, about making decisions, about more or higher quality circularity alternatives, you could call it. And finally, she applied this heuristic in a case that also then used the food system again, because it was applied to the wine production in France at the end. Now, yeah, as I just mentioned, there are two, you could say, roots or theoretical or conceptual roots of Rachel's work. And on the right-hand side, you see these frameworks that most of you have probably also came across already, that our institute is working a lot with, these concepts of niches, regimes, and more longer-term landscape trends. And this notion of several decades evolutions of transitions and all these interacting effects between these regimes, niches, and landscape dynamics. And then at the other end was the idea of the circular economy. So to basically the vision, you could say, of replacing a more linear understanding of producing or extracting, producing, using, throwing away towards more circular material flows of reusing, of recycling, of recovering materials, or even better, of leaving virgin materials in the ground. Now, the first work that Rachel did started actually with an interesting case that was not explicitly referring to the food, energy, water nexus, but while conducting her interviews, we realized that it's actually a nice representation of that food, energy, water nexus, because she worked on catering services and the HoReCa sector. So she was thinking about or asking how basically alternative, more circular alternative services in the catering sector, how they may further diffuse, how they may become more institutionalized, how they may become picked up by more mainstream actors. And we found an interesting example in relation to our Rotterdam Urban Living Lab, because that is focusing, at least in part, also on circular food innovations. And then we became aware that there was a large catering company, a large catering corporation, Sodexo. And Sodexo basically did workshops at the Rotterdam Urban Living Lab about more circular, more sustainable food or catering alternatives. So there was a bit of a, so to say, a learning step related to the Urban Living Lab with an international catering company. And then we even better heard that one of the Dutch ministries, the Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment, started to incorporate some of these circular services in through their green procurement regulations, and that in their canteens they picked up some of these circular catering alternatives. And that's basically the case that Rachel looked into. So she conducted a series of interviews and mapped, so to say, the involved actors and, you could say, knowledge flows and knowledge exchanges. And in the end, she also included some quantitative values for, so to say, as success indicators for how the Dutch ministry was able to reduce CO2 emissions in terms of their canteens and the percentage of animal proteins and the reduction of food waste through picking up some of these niche alternatives. And well, the key outcome is basically in this table on the right, which you see here again, that she looked into. Yeah, she summarized it as 15 principles for how these niches need to become more connected or integrated with incumbent practices and with regime actor practices to stimulate, so to say, this diffusion and the uptake of these alternative practices. And among them are, so to say, also a bit of usual suspects, like building new network connections, overcoming silo thinking, and it really was a clear hint that those platforms such as Urban Living Labs, particularly the one in Rotterdam, can really serve maybe as new, you could say, intermediaries for this type of niche regime interactions, at least to stimulate or instigate these new learning procedures between established regime actors and these innovators. While studying these innovators, it became obvious that in the Rotterdam Urban Living Lab, which most of you know had this very strong entrepreneurial focus, so a very strong focus on these startups, circular startups that are experimenting with circular economy business models. And through the interviews with some of them, it became obvious that some of them were really running into a dilemma, because in the early phases of their experimentation, they often started using waste streams. For example, some of you may remember, because we visited the lab, there's a startup who's working with smashed mango from the port of Rotterdam, and they use it actually and have a process to bring this into a leather-like product. And they basically use this leather equivalent product then to actually create bags or shoe materials out of it. But so far they get these smashed mango peels for free. So the port is saying, yeah, you know, we have to pay for that food waste so far, so just carry it into your lab, that's fine. But then we realized the moment this becomes a commodified stream, so the moment certain actors consider this waste stream as a resource, that really can switch the whole model, that the waste then becomes a price and becomes commodified, and that often threatens, so to say, in early phases, these alternative circular business models. And that's what Rachel nicely framed as the waste resource paradox. So she created this, or a colleague of us together with Rachel created this figure on the right hand side that as long as a residual waste is, so to say, considered as a waste and does not have a price tag on it, so to say, a lot of these innovators have economically speaking, have a model that is sufficient, so to say. But then we found a couple of examples where then the residual waste receives a price tag, and that actually threatens then the circular model, where the residual waste obviously becomes an input again into the new as a resource. And yeah, in the paper, Rachel, you could say, unpacks then these dilemmas and implications, and she goes through a couple of examples. From food and fashion industry, but also from plastics, and again with Sodexo in reducing food waste. And she highlights that actually with some of these alternatives and with some of these waste resource paradox situations, that these circular practices or alternatives could even reinforce or tighten then the lock-in of existing linear structures. So that would be really counterproductive to a transition to a circular economy. And one of the ideas that we wrote in the paper to overcome this is obviously referring back to these ideas of strategic niche management literature. So we suggest that these innovators, these niches, need maybe some longer time of, you could say, nurturing or protection from these market forces. That could be additional subsidies, that could be a higher continuity of the lab structures where they can continue experimenting or diversify also their circular business models. And that brought Rachel then to her third part of her thesis, And that's this, most of you have seen this idea of creating a, you could say, decision logic, or a logic of identifying higher quality over lower quality circularity alternatives to an existing material flow or waste output, you could say. We conducted also a series of workshops with some of you, where we were interested in your critical feedback and in, so to say, testing the logics of this decision tree behind it. Maybe, I mean, a personal note from my side, maybe Rachel was also very ambitious with this. I think it's a very valuable contribution, but in terms of an immediate application in practice, we also got some critical feedbacks that I think were very valuable. So my take currently on it is it's a very promising idea, but it also needs further elaboration. For example, in the workshop in the Netherlands with some ministries and also some circular economy consultancy companies, we realized that the question of investments and costs of these alternatives was not explicitly covered, so to say, in her model. It was a bit of in between but not explicitly covered, and those practice partners immediately got to this point. So if they would consider this higher quality circularity contributions in terms of, so to say, higher emission reductions or higher amounts of upcycling waste streams, in how far that would increase, for example, costs for the entity, for the organization to do so compared to their existing model, which is obviously a very crucial aspect why a lot of companies or organizations are, so to say, shying away of choosing such options, and rather end up, so to say, at the lower quality recycling options. Now, I want to end with the fourth paper, also not to take too much time from the other PhD students. What we still were keen on, or what Rachel still was keen on then, is to test the logics of this heuristic again in the, you could say, wider food sector. And Rachel has also worked and has done life cycle assessment and material flow analysis in the wine sector before she came to Drift. So she was really motivated to work on wine and the wine sector and viticulture. And it's interesting, a quite overlooked sector that really did a lot of, I have to say, greenwashing in the past. So it was pretty interesting to see, or to use basically this framework to identify circular economy alternatives in the wine sector. That paper is written but not yet submitted, and what is in the heart of that paper is basically, first of all, an analysis of why French winemakers, so to say, do not pick up circular economy alternatives over their existing procedures, potential for accelerating these circular practices, but also governance actions needed, or proposed governance actions to support this. These are in a nutshell again the key findings. So part one, and I'm happy to share all the papers, is about these mechanisms or actions, how niche and regime actors may relate more to each other to accelerate such transitions, and how urban living labs may play a role there. Then this critical perspective of the race-resource paradox, this decision logic of the CDMT, and finally the application in the wine sector. And what I really enjoyed reading in Rachel's thesis is in one of her last chapters, she summarized on the one hand some key lessons. I'm not going through them now, but also a couple of paradoxes that go beyond this waste-resource paradox. And I think that's always nice to end a thesis with that. It's again a full PhD thesis is again a starting point for the next PhD thesis, you could say. So she's raising a couple of paradoxes and interesting contestations that are worth further studies. And yeah, I'm also as a supervisor happy to end here with the defense date, which is now scheduled for June 23rd. And I'm also happy, I just read, if I'm not mistaken, that Sue confirmed being in the larger committee, and that's obviously also great to hear. I think that's it. Thanks for listening, and I'm sorry for running a bit over time.
We've got any questions or comments? Okay.
I'd like to see the wine page.
Yes, so that was really interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, maybe a quick comment. Indeed, that was, I mean, that was a bit the saddest part, that we couldn't get into real empirical work on the French vineyards due to COVID last year. So it was mostly conceptual work and online interviews. I was really hoping for some wine testings. But it's going to be interesting also as a personal reflection to publish in this Journal of Wine Economics. I actually never had heard about such a journal before. So let's see how they will respond to this type of contribution.
Okay, so what we're doing now is ask Erica if she'd like to go now.
Tina, are you okay to stop sharing?
Yeah.
Just talk to Tina.
Sure.
Thank you, Tina.
And then over lunchtime, we've actually got two films. One by Johnny. Yes. Because he was supposed to be here today, but he couldn't be here today with his poster. So there's a 3-minute film from him. And then another one that Anna's suggested that we might find interesting about an informal settlement in Kenya. And it relates back to Michelle's talk and to sort of education and younger children, and sort of bringing these ideas to the younger generation so that they grow up with them. And then hopefully the next generation are a bit more flexible than we do. So those will be, we'll be showing those on the screen whilst we have our lunch, which is just arrived. That's good. So I'll ask Erica then to update us on the situation in Sao Paulo.
Hello for all. I'm a bit late, sorry for that. I'll show the last results, because last year I showed the middle of the project from my postdoctorate. I'm Erica from the University of Campinas, and I work with Professor Esther Del Pos in São Paulo. So, for the people that don't know about the project, the project of São Paulo ULL is being institution focused on innovation and sustainability in food production, and of course looking for an aim to transition for the production transition of the region, and of course public choice approach too. So according to the governance of Waste Fuel Consortium, we're looking for how we develop the modeling, the ACD modeling, science and dynamics modeling. So our more challenging, it's because our region is between the big city, São Paulo, and the Atlantic Forest. So it's a big challenge to modeling and to work with its kind of production, of its kind of systems, because it's not about for example, a conventional production, to make a transition from conventional to agroecological, but a big challenge is because the big city from São Paulo, because we have a big pressure from the buildings going to inside the forest. Sue and Yana visit there, and so it's a beautiful place, but it's a delicate place to work. So how was the project? First, map and model the level of sustainability of fuel systems. For 2 pilots, I work with this region, São Paulo, between São Paulo and Forest Atlantic, and another region near São Paulo, it's Ibiúna city. The same case, there's a forest, Atlantic Forest, and a city, but Ibiúna, it's a small city, so it's more easy to control the buildings, the pressure for the control the houses inside the forest. So how we did the simulation? Developed 5 types of simulation for 5 types of food production. Well, the first model was for conventional agroecological system, as I showed the last year. Of course, are different kind of production, but the model is the only one with difference between the inputs in the system model systems. The second was aquaponics. We had a partner, really good partner, Symbiotec, from another university, USP, from Piracicaba. It's near Limeira, Campinas. And the last one is hydroponics. And we noted visiting the cities, for the hydroponics, we saw 2 kinds of models, because the conventional hydroponics didn't use the solution, concentrated solution. So it's a big problem, because each 50 days, they emission all the concentrated solution for the rivers. So we've developed 2 kinds of models, one with no reuse and another with reuse, because some companies are made this more green production too for hydroponics. So this is our flow chart, the first. So all models started with a flow chart for we understand all the flows between the dynamic variables, stocks, inputs, and outputs too. And all the models, we had the similar environment, economic, social indicators. The first is Tropic State Index. It's a proxy for eutrophisation. We used a methodology validated not just in Brazil, but abroad too, to analyzing more fast and easy the state of eutrophication. The other net profit here, it's the last name, sorry, but we changed the name with the during the project, the Land Social Development Index, and the footprint for water and carbon. So this is the first model for aquaponics. As I mentioned last year, we work with the draw of model, and after my last presentation, we optimized all models, and we developed the predictive scenarios for all kinds of models. For example, pessimistic and optimistic scenarios too. This just for the hydroponics conventional systems. So it's a more easy, more simple process, because how I told you, each 15, 20 days, they send the emissions, send the concentrated solution for the rivers. This is the hydroponics with reuse. So we have a loop inside the process. So when the high concentration solution reach a concentration that is bad for example, lettuce or other kinds of cultures, this solution is redirected for another kind of production for more strong cultures. So, for example, for the dark green cultures, because the affinity for the concentration, it's more easy to don't lose this kind of cultures. And this is the last one. How I told this model, the open production, it's the only one model with different. For example, for conventional inputs, when I running this model in conventional, we use the data for conventional, and the data for agroecological is null for this case, and vice versa. And when I run in agroecological, the data for conventional are null, and we run it to show the end, because the systems, it's the same. Just as the professor, I don't know if professor, sorry, commented, the input is so hard, the chemical inputs for conventional. So we simulate for agroecological different kinds of organic inputs too, not just one kind of input. So the predictive scenarios, we work with 6. The first, it's the pessimist. For example, is the production without any kind of improvement in the systems. The 2, from 2 to 4, we developed the scenarios with CAC in random mode, because in Brazil we don't have historical data for CAC. It's difficult. I think it's not just Brazil, because we search a lot, and it's impossible to find a big data, real data for CAE. And in the case for the 2, from 2 to 4, we work with implementation of EAC, that's Ecosystem Service Index, from the 1% per month to 10% per month. And in the case of EAC, sorry, we work with different kinds of strategies. For example, for the hydroponics and aquaponics, we use the phosphorus waste reduction, because we have a waste, a small waste or a big waste in the water concentration. The rainwater we use too for the hydroponics and aquaponics. The change of the traditional energy search, we have a different kind of reduction for all kinds of systems, and for fertilizer reduction for the conventional and aquaponics systems models, because we're looking for different kinds, for example, for conventional fertilizers, and we use the high concentration to reduce it to the minimum in legislations and for the procedures for the companies. In the case of organic fertilizers, we study 2 different kinds. The more common and more cheap fertilizer, organic fertilizer, until the more expensive, but the more efficient too, and the more ecological too. So we reduce it from the top to the minimum necessary to the cultures, for all cultures. So this is, let's see, yes. This example of the model running, it's aquaponic models. So we get now online graphs to analyze, but all the outputs we export for the Excel spreadsheet, analyze with R2 for graphs, for statistical tools too. And we could observe online how was the results with implementation of CAA or ESCI 2. So this is for all. In this case, I simulated both for Ibiúna city and for Parelheiros, because Parelheiros it's a neighborhood from São Paulo, where all concentrations of small producers is inside. So for that moment, sorry, this is the first is running, but I showed them the results. So as I told, the net profit, we changed the name for the land use earnings because we use not high economic involved in the simulation. We just studied the properties, the small properties. So, for example, as I told about a carbon footprint, we just analyzed the carbon footprint inside the property, not all supply chain, all how can I say, all the inputs, for example, the fertilizer production. So we just analyze the only properties because with this we can comparing face to face the properties and face to face the different kind of models. So the first for the land use earnings, this both figures, it's for conventional and agroecological cultures. These results are in the sustainability article that we submitted days ago, weeks ago. So it's just a part. We got a lot of results, so it's impossible to show all. So I selected just for conventional and agroecological. So was really interesting for us because when we analyze the pessimist scenarios from the first scenarios without implementation, no implementation, we had a bad scenarios for both production. It's the black sensitive, the black line. And when we work with implementation of strategies, we have up in the results. We have improvement of these indicator results. The accuracy that we got the results for was for PAS. It's a payment for environment service, because we have different kinds of project initiatives in São Paulo and all the country about the payment. And we had a new legislation from the last year about the payment. But the results shows us the payment shows marginal profile as economic for small producers. So this is really nice because we could talk with some partners, some stakeholders about that to promote more improvement, to change this payment to more higher amounts for the small producers, because sometimes the small producers aren't convinced to adapt the production for agroecological, for to doing the transition, because the economy, the money, it's so slow for them. So was so nice to check with the modeling and to help our stakeholders to improve the convincement, the small productions, and to negotiate with governments, state, federal, it's not high, it's bad, but state, maybe it's better. The second, the social development index, we saw the same. When we have a pessimistic scenarios, we don't have a good results. We have a pessimistic results of indicator. And when we improve some CASA and some ESI in the systems, we have an improvement of the indicator. And in this case, between 5 and 10%, we didn't get a significant results. So it's not necessary to input more higher improvement as 10%. So a middle of percent of improvement, it's necessary to adapt it to transition these kind of systems to a high level of sustainability too. And it's so interesting for us because as I told you, we work with simulation for small productions, only production. But in this case, the results for the small area don't show impact for the rivers related to eutrophication. Of course, just one, as conventional agroecological is important for the eutrophication process because they needed a high amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and organic matter. So we simulated in the same way for a big region. So we get the data from the area, from a medium region around São Paulo and total region around São Paulo. And the simulation, when we saw the results, was so interesting because for agroecological, the first picture, we don't have a significant impact of eutrophisation in the area since a common situation through the crisis situation when we have a slow season of rain, we don't have a big impact for eutrophisation. But when we compare to conventional, yes, we saw the impact. In all kinds of conventional, we have the impact. Also, we use the high improvements of reduction of nitrogen, phosphorus in the simulation, in the systems. So we could solve here the eutrophisation, the eutrophic index in between the medium to bad for the worst profile of eutrophication. And it's not how can I say? It's not I forgot the name. Sorry, a constant improvement of eutrophication because we have a different dilution of the nitrogens of the pollution for the base raisins. So we have a good area for the water, but in the same way we had good results show the increase of eutrophisation in these areas of São Paulo. And for the footprints, the first case is the water footprint. In the same way, for carbon and for water footprint, for agroecological systems, we get a good results. Not for the scenarios with improvement, but the scenarios, the bad scenarios, we don't have a big impact for each properties. But when we compare with the carbon with the conventional production, for the water footprint, yes, we have a considerable impact for the use of the water, because of course the limit of the use, the irrigation, it's higher for the conventional than the agroecological systems. And for the carbon footprint, as I told, because we just simulate for the property, we don't have how can I say, a bad carbon footprint, a bad emissions, a high emissions, because it's just small properties. And of course, for this kind of cultures, we don't have a high GHG emissions. But we think about other kind of cultures, probably this will be really different. For example, Brazil, it's a big production of soil. So probably this kind of cultures will be a high impact than this horticulture, lettuce, and other kinds of leaves. And this show a global analysis for all, because in the project we developed a benchmarking for each of sustainable indicators. So we could see the change between the years without improvement and with improvement. How I told for the trophic stage index, just for the region, we get the better results, the ultimate level for the carbon and water footprint too, because it's small properties. But for the land use areas and for the land social developments, we had the worst results. So for the environment, we don't have bad results, bad situation for small producers. But the social area and the economic area for these small families, it's so bad. So as the professor told you, we needed to change. We need to organize projects to make a transition to help these people, because these areas, it's poor families, poor people, and I visit the regions. I noted a lot of families selling the properties for other kinds of production, for industries or for the habitation. So it's a big challenge to work, to maintain, to fix these families there, not just to help these families, these poor people, but to defend the forest, to defend all the environment around these properties, this production. So with the modeling, we note the SDM modeling too was efficient to demonstrate the behavior of production systems by measuring the relationships between the inputs, outputs, all the conflicts in systems productions. For all at São Paulo UOL was too efficient to qualify the possible effects in predictive scenarios too. And the simulation scenarios were based on numerous policies based in technological advances and organizational innovations too, not just to reduce emissions, but to think about the CAA as to short the supply chain and to improve more economic for the small properties. So is this, thank you. The results you will show in the sustainability as soon as possible, I hope. And the others, I'm finishing other article with all the results from conventional and agroecological. And the next we working with hydroponics versus aquaponics to show the difference when we use the effluent from hydroponics to aquaponics and without this kind of reuse. So this.
Questions or comments? Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, didn't see that.
With just a question about your scenarios, and you've got these community supported agriculture index, which I'm wondering what that does in your model. So what kind of influence does it have in your simulation? What kind of things does it affect? And in your scenarios, you've got two variables, or two variants of that, one with 0 and one with random numbers.
1%, 5%, and 10%.
That's the ecological. I'm talking about the community support agriculture. Seems to be a random value.
Yes, a random was for the CAA.
Yes.
Yes.
So two questions. A, what is that the CSAI? What does that do in the models, and why do you pick a random value as opposed to a?
The value was from 0 to 1, the maximum, because we don't have the historical data to simulate. For example, in Brazil, the CAA it's between 0 and 0.5 or 0.7. So if we fix it a value, wasn't real, a real profile in Brazil. So we programming the model, the analogic model, for to work in random. And this way, we could get results between 0 and 1 point of CAA against to the improvement of the ACI. In this case, was the payment for environment service, and was interesting because the payment didn't influence anything because it's so slow. It's so the amount the payment amount of payment it's so slow for the producers. So we could show for the government department that the projects didn't work to convince the small producers to get to start a transition. Of course, the producers have a result after 1 year, 2 years, indirect results, economics, because they are with the transition, the supply chain it's short, and they have a different kind of products. So it's improve the economic for the small producers, but the results from the payment environment services didn't show no advances for them. So it's a big question because some producers, it's difficult to talk with them. Oh, your economic will be better with the payment in the first moment because don't have. For example, 4 months, the payment it's just 1 time per year, and per hectare it's 1,000 reais per hectare. So it's so small for them. So to convince the small producers in the future, 1, 2, 3, 5 years, your payment will be better because the indirect ways will get to you more conditions. It's difficult to prove. So this tool will help not the small producers, but will help the Department of Agriculture, the NGOs to change the kind of projects, the initiatives with the small producers and get a better transition in these areas too. And now we are translating the scientific results for more common for this NGO use, because it's difficult for the NGO use this kind of graphics, figures to negotiate with the producers too.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let's do Ali and Matt. Oh, no, sure.
Well, Matt's post is there. He is online. If there are any questions before support.
So, is Ali going to be talking to his poster, or is he just going to stand there? Yeah. Okay, so the other 2 PhDs then, Ali, who's here in person, who's an actual real flesh person, his poster is at the front here, so let's go and have a chat with him. And then Matt's poster there, he's online, but Marco is going to be his avatar, so you can ask him questions.
I'll be there and maybe explain a couple of things, but the questions become too difficult.
Yes.
Call in Matt, who's online anyway. So.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe we can ask him.
Sue Eleanor is here as well.
Yeah, she's giving me a talk.
But she's giving, oh, you're giving a talk?
Yeah, that's okay.
Very good. Yeah.
So lunch is all, we're having lunch now, are we?
Yeah.
Okay, so lunch is at the back then. Sorry, Timo. I hope you've got, I don't know, corned beef sandwiches. So please do help yourselves. It is now 10 to 1. I would like to start on time at 1:30 after lunch. And if you're still eating, then we can sit and eat. So let's just dive in.
Very strange.
I know it's not.
My name is Ali. You've met before. Can you remind me? Sinead. So I can be was it kind of misplay the misplay? So this one,
This one here.
Part of this project, so my work is loaded on this.
So I think
Yes. Because you know 5 acres around and when they start there,
Carry on.
It's not quite there. So it wasn't really a piece to tell.
Yeah.
On the way, we crossed the street. It was funny because it was a culture, and then she said, then we walked to her while we were crossing anyway. Oh, I mean, and then we didn't. I think she went for the simulation.
Yeah.
Just telling to her when we met Peter when she was in the meeting crossing the road. At least she wasn't.
No, there was no delays.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you're right.
You keep them up. Good. No, it's good. It's good. I think it's good.
Yeah.
How is
Yes. Did you say on that? It must be.
I won't keep it some of your busy doing stuff, but I have a number of different things I need to do. Is it best for me to, shall I just come up and plug my thing in? Or?
Yeah, it's just a line that's more like.
It's probably easier. Let me see if that works. Can I just plug it in now?
Yeah.
All right. I think it's definitely showing my screen somewhere. Ah. Screen when you press laptop. That's just an HDMI. I wonder if it needs me to plug in, so sometimes it needs power. Should I just go and try my power cable?
Yeah. Yeah, Tannum's just trying to see if he can plug his laptop into work. Oh.
Those supposed to be like categories, but meditating is just for that reason, I can see that it's almost very.
Do you have it on a stick?
Yeah, I do. Okay. I don't have all of it on the stick. I'm going to have to copy some of the stuff over.
Maybe that one.
So definitely. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
What did you do?
I took the everything stick out.
Ah. Aha. Brilliant. I can't see there. I probably need a mirror.
So if so it's like the difference between the background, just being using your instrument and actually seeing it. So your interpretation tells you that, oh, I can actually see this. Interpretation is like the lowest interpretation. Yes, I don't know more actually I can say yes. So as for my so like this is and respond 9. So it's very tiny. And the reason why we're doing that is compounds. So imagine that you have water, but then you have them violently for example, yes, during that's before yes, you can really see when they're not after I say yes,
Just